Please welcome Dr. Ethan Burris.
Thanks, Greg. First of all, everyone can hear me okay? Awesome. So thank you, Greg, for having me. I'm really excited to be here. So as Greg mentioned, I study employee voice. That is what leads employees to speak up, have candid conversations with their bosses about what's working and what's not, how their bosses respond to that, which is sometimes really, really positive and other times not quite so much. And then more generically, how to make those conversations a bit smoother. Most of my research is in the field, so I do surveys and interviews, and I work with organizations to help change some of their processes. And I'll be talking through a couple of those research projects, and just as one example, I spent about the last 4 months over the summer working with Google on a lot of these issues. And so as we start to go through today, it's going to be a little bit different, I imagine, than some of the talks you've had before. We're going to focus less on sort of the technical side and more on the people side. So how do you get people to feel comfortable with this process and engaging in it? So let me kind of start with what I think you guys should take away from this. First, I think there is some voice that you want, and there's a lot of voice that you don't. And we're going to talk about what some of those contingencies are. And that'll lead us to what I like to call half-hearted attempts at soliciting voice. So tactics that I see a lot of organizations try to use in order to encourage people to speak up, but it actually undermines a lot of the dynamics that they're trying to solve for. And then lastly, we're going to kind of end with what I see as some more robust strategies. So with that, let's kind of dive in. At least when I talk about voice, I talk about it in a number of ways. First is, there's one type of voice which is clearly about like whistleblowing, wrongdoing, illegal, immoral stuff. This is Kenneth Kendrick, who is an engineer, a process engineer actually, in a peanut manufacturing plant in West Texas. And he spoke up about salmonella that was in a peanut factory, and similarly got fired after that. And he was in a very small town, and the company actually worked very hard for him not to get a job after that too. Horrible story, very nice individual. I don't talk about that quite as much. A second type of voice is focused on employee mistreatment. This is where we see a lot of unions or grievance filing come about. It's a formalized process to make people or employees feel more comfortable about changing the conversation with management about particular policies and practices. Again, it's a super useful avenue for soliciting employee feedback, but again, not really what I study. What I study is what I like to call improvement-oriented voice. And from the conversations I had with many of you last night and some today, this is what KaiNexus is trying to get at. It's sort of the everyday opportunities for learning. It's the noticing of particular problems, and then are you going to speak up about them in such a way to try and make changes? So as a couple examples, at least I've seen them in my work. The first from healthcare, so this is a emergency department nurse. They tried to cut back our police staffing that we had here, and we absolutely refused it and pitched a fit. We had a nurse who got beat up in one of our rooms by a psych patient. She ended up leaving the ER for that, and that devastated us. So an example of a very serious issue around staffing and how it impacts not only patient safety, but staff safety and staff satisfaction. Then there's, of course, a lot of work processes. This is a quote from an insurance company sales associate. They were talking about their pitch for how they make sales calls for people to buy insurance products. And if you've ever had a pitch from a salesperson in insurance, they ask you a whole litany of questions. This person was complaining that they didn't ask about other things like, have you had an accident by hitting a deer? It's not really a normal question you'd ask on the phone, but it impacts premiums quite a bit. So they would make one quote, and the quote would jump up in price afterwards on down the line. So a problem with the process of the sales pitch. And then, of course, the more ubiquitous, like we all like to be the manager, but not necessarily have a manager. And so a lot of the comments are around that leadership process. Why is this stuff really important? Well, sort of the theory goes that if you let 1,000 flowers bloom, that is, you cultivate a lot of ideas from employees, then the best ones will sort of surface to the top. And as managers, we can pick those out, decide which ones we like the best that fit our strategic goals, and then we can start to work to implement them. The difficulty that at least I've seen in my research is that this process is super, super hard to facilitate on a routine basis. For the most part, these behaviors are voluntary. You can't require them as part of the job. People are mostly trained to do their job, not necessarily to think about all the ways they would change it. It's really challenging for leaders to hear this feedback about all the things they need to do to fix all these problems. And perhaps the biggest issue of them all, when people stay silent, you can't observe that they actually have ideas that would improve the place. So it's super, super challenging for managers to sort of deal with this problem and figure out what to do. And so if a question that kind of comes about, well, how often do people speak up? Do they routinely withhold ideas that they have? And what might we do to actually resolve that? I'll go through a couple stats real quick. This is from a study I did with about a dozen different credit unions, so kind of like banks that are a bit more mission-oriented. And we had access to about 3,500 people. We did some surveys, and about half of them bothered to write down a specific suggestion for improvement. Opportunity for voice, an OI, if I have the terminology right. So after doing this, we followed up with, well, did you actually speak up about that? Did you tell a manager or someone who has the authority to take action on that issue? And only about 40% did. So at any given time, you're missing out on 60% of the ideas that employees have, at least from these organizations. Now, some of you who manage this process a lot may be thinking that is awesome because now I don't have to deal with 60% of more ideas on my plate. So then we went and followed up with the top management teams for each of these organizations. And we asked them to rate the overall novelty, the feasibility, and the value of each and every one of these 1,700 ideas. And among those that were rated the top 100 ideas as rated by the senior management teams of each of these organizations, the same 40% told their boss. So not only missing out 60% of the ideas overall, but 60% of the best ones. And just to kind of round it out, even those employees who report themselves as being most vocal, most proactive, most extroverted, super engaging, I'm assuming you guys all know who those folks are, they still withhold some amount of ideas. So even though you're hearing a lot, it may not mean that you're hearing everything that you should. So one question is why do people withhold? And from the research, there's kind of two primary reasons. My first of many Dilbert cartoons. So the first is a sense of fear. That is, when people speak up, they're met with some sort of repercussion. This is a quote from one of the financial service reps from the credit unions. A specific work problem we've been experiencing lately is that when one person speaks their mind about the company, they've either been fired or moved to a different branch. You know, if that's the outcome that is perceived most often, then it's not really much of a surprise that people are going to hold back. But perhaps more damning is not necessarily a sense of fear, but a sense of futility. And that is, even when people do speak up and they feel safe in doing so, nothing actually happens, nothing changes as a result of that. So this is a senior marketing manager pretty high up within a pharmaceutical company. It's not so much we can't speak up in the sense we'll be fired, it's more that we won't speak up because we know we won't be heard, and in a sense that's even worse. So the question is, how do you start to solve these problems? And honestly, that's been the thrust of my research for about the last 10 years. I'm going to go a little bit academic on you and talk about a political economist, and then I'll round about to something that we can actually implement. There's a guy by the name of Albert Hirschman who in 1970 was interested in this dynamic of why people check out and they don't vote. And if you think about it, there's a lot of similarities between people being engaged in civic duties versus being engaged within the organization and wanting to improve it. And so his basic argument is that when people feel a sense of dissatisfaction, either with government or within an organization, they have two basic responses. Either they engage and they speak up a bunch, or they disengage and they look to exit. They don't vote or they quit. And so one of my very first studies in this, we started to look at employees' choices between these. When do they engage and when do they not? And we did this in a national restaurant chain, Steak and Shake, kind of like Denny's, really fun place. As we started going through there, and asking questions around, well, when, as an employee, when do you really speak up? Why are you engaged? Why are you not? And, well, what would lead you to check out greener pastures elsewhere? What would make you look to move somewhere else? One of the surprising things for us is that this level of engagement, it wasn't an either or. It wasn't that people were engaged and they spoke up or disengaged and they exited. It's that when people spoke up in some of these restaurants, there was this true sort of learning cycle that I think you guys have been talking about over the course of today, where people speak up, management is oriented towards that, they devote resources, they take action, and the employees see that as getting much, much better. And so because they speak up and because they are engaged, it actually leads to more engagement down the line and they're less likely to check out and quit. But for others, there was also a high level amount of voice. People spoke up a ton. But because they did and they weren't met with a lot of positive outcomes, there was sort of bred a sense of frustration. And so the voice, the amount of speaking up was an example of an environment that was rife with problems and a little willingness to address it. So it wasn't so much about this choice between am I going to quit and give up or am I going to speak up, but it's a relationship between those two. So when I voice, when you adopt these sorts of practices like KaiNexus and contribute to these OIs, what happens afterwards? And so we found kind of 3 different behaviors from managers about when and what type of voice was actually beneficial. So one, when managers were oriented toward change, when they were actually looking for reasons to improve the place, to make changes. Secondly, when middle managers had resources to actually address it. I was talking with Francis from Bridgestone last night about sort of a lot of middle managers feeling stuck that they're getting a lot of feedback from below, and then they don't have a whole lot of resources to actually take action on that. And so people at the top want a lot of voice, and people at the bottom want to give it, but people in the middle sort of feel constrained in between. And so this is an example. In this particular organization, in restaurants where the managers were very much oriented towards change, it led to employees, when they spoke up, to feel that stuff was getting better. It led to an increased sense of engagement and a reduction in turnover by about 30%. And for this organization that was averaging about 180% turnover for each year, so each restaurant was turning over almost twice, this is real money that they're saving. In other organizations where there was a lot of voice, but not a whole lot of willingness to do something with those ideas, you actually saw very much an increase in turnover as a result. So kind of the first takeaway is, there's some types of voice that actually leads to action. And if you talk about the role of lean improvements and of these types of initiatives, what employees want is some change. Otherwise, it's a lot of hot air. So in a second study, we started to look at, well, what type of voice actually leads to these types of changes? Where do people actually direct their ideas? And so within a particular unit, you can look at speaking up directly to your own boss. You can look at speaking sideways to a set of colleagues within a group. You can look at speaking up to leaders of other units, other groups within the organization. And as a leader of a particular business unit, you can also get ideas from people not only beneath you within the chain of command, but outside that as well. And we started to kind of map out these, for lack of a better term, a social network of these different business units to try and understand when someone has an idea, where does it flow within the organization? And are there some types of targets that actually yields better action and some types of targets that don't? And what we found is that when voice is directed to the people who have the power and the resources to take action, like leaders of each of these units, it led to not only changes, but actual increase in performance. And when there's a lot of voice that flowed around the leaders, that is, speaking sideways to their colleagues, we actually saw performance suffer by quite a bit. And so the way I like to kind of pitch this is we often talk a lot about fostering an environment where people are free to exchange information with their colleagues and sort of test out ideas. But it becomes a waste of time if you don't actually facilitate a way to get those ideas up the chain of command to someone who can actually do something with it. And then so the last type of theme for when voice is beneficial or not is when it actually leads managers to be receptive. And I'll walk through this story real quick. You can think about different ways to pitch ideas. So like the framing for how you construct a pitch. And in a couple different studies, we've looked at two different categories. You can pitch an idea as framing it as this brand new opportunity. Here's a great new idea that you have, and here's all the wonderful things that will come about of it. You can also take that same idea and pitch it as a threat. So if we don't take action on this, then something bad will happen, and it's a way to sort of generate some interest or urgency around it. Well, these two different types of framings also map onto different personality theories. And there's one personality concept called regulatory focus, which describes how people are motivated and when they're motivated to take action or not. And so there's one type of personality called promotion focus, and those folks very much play to win. You can kind of think about your typical entrepreneur who's very much engaged towards action. The worst outcome for them is an action that is not taken, an opportunity that is wasted, that they didn't go down that road. For other folks who have what's called a prevention focus, they sort of play not to lose. They're motivated by making sure nothing goes wrong. And so the worst outcome for them is to take an action and actually make a mistake. And so you can start to see how these different types of personalities may map onto how the framing for the ideas that are pitched. And so to kind of walk through this chart, sorry, the font's a little bit small here. For ideas that are framed as a threat versus an opportunity, the opportunity framing works really well for managers that are more promotion focused, that are geared towards wanting to take those risks and those new ideas. But the very same type of idea that is pitched as a threat resonates much better for managers that are hesitant to act in a way that would mess things up. So for a moment, think about the OIs that you see on an everyday, and think about how they're pitched in your own organizations. And think about the particular managers who are evaluating them, and whether there's a systematic difference between the types of ideas that they naturally gravitate towards because it's framed in a way that's consistent with their personality. And it opens up this idea that some managers may be more biased towards looking for some ideas just by the way that they're pitched, rather than the underlying merits of what they actually have to say. So these three themes: voice is beneficial, some voice is beneficial, but it leads to benefits when action is taken. Employees can see those benefits. They actually become more engaged as a result of these types of activities and are willing to come back again with more ideas. But voice is also only beneficial if it actually makes to the right people who have the resources, the power, the political will to see these changes through. And of course, you have to pitch an idea in a way that actually resonates with those individuals. And if you don't have those types of conditions, then you end up making a lot of pitches for ideas and new initiatives that sort of falter along the way, and you can actually be in a worse state off than if you never solicited their feedback in the first place. So then the question becomes, well, what to do? How do you start to encourage these types of conversations? And I'll walk through what I call some of these half-hearted attempts, and my guess is after listening to a lot of success stories throughout the day, we'll start to poke fun at a lot of mistakes that other organizations have made. So the first thing that I hear a lot is, well, you have to be nice. Don't be a jerk. If you're a jerk and start to fire people as a result of people coming your way, then that's obviously not a good thing. And the second is be available. That is having the proverbial open door. But I don't think I have ever heard anyone say that I have a closed door policy when it comes to this kind of stuff, right? I usually find that most people are generally nice. most people generally want this feedback in the abstract, but when it comes time to actually take tangible actions to get it, that's where we start to falter. So I'm going to quickly walk through a couple tactics here, and then we'll round out with some more robust ways to solicit. So the first is the use of anonymous reporting suggestion systems. Now I know KaiNexus, I believe almost 100% of the ideas there are identified. So when an employee logs in, you see who is nominating those ideas, and you can track it all the way through. That's lovely, but a lot of organizations are very concerned about creating a safe environment, so they create a space where people can offer these suggestions in a way that is anonymous and not identified. And of course, you get this type of feedback where employees still really aren't willing to be honest because there's still repercussions. If the dominant way that you're getting feedback is through an anonymous suggestion system, it really signals to employees that it's not safe to give ideas any other way. The second are some of these more subtle cues. So outside of an online system like KaiNexus, I want you to think about the ways that you would have to pitch an idea to your boss and where you would start to have those conversations. And most of the time, you would have to make a specific appointment with your boss and go to your boss's office in some way. For me, if I want to make a pitch to my dean, I have to walk downstairs to the first floor in the dean's suite where she sits now. I have to go through 3 doors and 4 secretaries in order to get there. And not that in and of itself is bad, it's the way the building's laid out, but it does send subtle signals about hierarchy and what that means and how comfortable this conversation will be. And that's really problematic because some leader influences are really overt. So for this quote, my boss is a bulldozer who blows nasty commands all the time. He destroys these meetings when he's there. No one will speak up. Like, that is super obvious for why people would hesitate there. But other times, employees' fears are a lot more subtle, and they're more sticky based on past experiences. So in these interviews that we did, we would ask people, why are you afraid to speak up? And they would say, oh, this person will fire me on the spot. It's really uncomfortable. And then you ask a couple other questions here or there, and about 5 minutes later, you follow up with, well, do you know of anyone in your organization who has ever lost their job because they spoke up? And the response is, well, everyone knows no one's ever fired in this place. So you're afraid of for speaking up because you're going to get fired, yet you also know that no one ever gets fired. And you can't have those two beliefs at the same time. This is a conversation with a manufacturing supervisor. So ever since that was 12 years ago, I still don't trust anybody. I'll say what I think is right. I won't say what I think is right in a meeting. This is the same manager that's in the current plant? No, that was 3 managers ago, 3 plant managers ago. Like, who's actually causing this problem for this employee to speak up? It's not you. It's not you as the leader, as the direct boss. It's sticky. It's someone else from time before. So if you have a lot of these subtle cues and you make people seek you out in your own office, then it creates a lot more difficulty in getting people to speak up. My last half-heart attempt about safety is, me as a manager, I'm not defensive. It's not personal. I can take the feedback, but then, of course, any feedback that comes our way is very much a personal thing. So one of my very favorite quotes, to some leaders, allowing employees to participate is viewed as an abdication of authority. Our role is, as the boss, as the leader in a lot of organizations, is to be the person who's in charge, to develop the policies, to work it out, and that's sort of an implicit theory that's there. And if you reinforce that in such a way, then employees are going to be a lot more hesitant. For futility, oftentimes we create, courage is for other people, so I'll create a very safe environment for my own employees, but then I won't actually take it up the chain of command to other folks. We often ask for input that we don't want to hear. I was talking with someone else last night, and there's a lot of programs that are in place around getting ideas for any and all parts of the organization. Yet top management team has a very specific strategic plan in place, and they will only implement a small sliver of it. And so if you open up and ask for feedback across the board, but you're really only going to implement a small bit, then you're creating a sense of futility when you really want something else. My last one is please waste more of my time. And this is where I think we're going to have a whole lot of fun in comparing it with KaiNexus. There are lots of employee suggestion programs out there. So IdeaStorm is at Dell. This is their internally facing one. They have one that's externally facing called EmployeeStorm. When I met with them, they touted and were so proud that they had collected 17,000 ideas from customers and employees. And then I followed up with, well, how many did you implement? And they said 50. Like, what signal does that send? Here at the University of Texas, we developed one of these called the Ideas of Texas. Very nice. You can log into the system, you can post your ideas, you can vote horns up or horns down for which ones you like or don't like. There's a lot of effort that went into the marketing of this and to get it out. And by and large, we collected a ton of ideas initially. 3 years later, they closed the program down. Within the first 3 months, they collected about 400 ideas. It took 8 months for the administration to follow up and tell any one person who submitted an idea what had happened. Over the next 2+ years, a couple more hundred, and then they implemented, it was a little bit less than 50. Most of the ideas were of the ilk of, the urinal in this bathroom is broken, and we should do something different with the flowers. They didn't really tackle the big issues at hand. So if you're going to bother going through these types of initiatives and then not sink your teeth into actually fixing it, you're going to create a lot worse state than what you were in before. So how can you more robustly encourage voice? I'll end with a few examples here. The first is to get out of your office. The open door is definitely not enough. If you think about this, there's a world of a difference between waiting for your employees to come knock on your door, to log into your system, to give you ideas on your own turf, versus you walking around and knocking on theirs. And I think that's ever important and relevant for systems like KaiNexus. It's a wonderful platform to collect ideas, but unless you follow that up with more of a personal invitation, you're not likely going to get as many ideas as what you'd like. The second is to soften the power cues. So let me give an example here. I don't know if you guys can see the two pictures up front. Can you tell who is the leader at each of these two tables? One on the right is pretty easy, right? You can see who's at the head of the table, who's not. So think about the context for how you set up these conversations when you get this type of feedback. As one example of just how subtle these cues are, I'll walk you through a very quick scenario that we gave both MBA students and patients for hospitals. So imagine you're a patient in this photo and you're there to discuss a stomach problem with a physician. After a basic examination that felt a little bit dismissive, the doctor tells you there's nothing to worry about, you can go home just fine. You still feel a twinge of discomfort, and so you're convinced that there's something else going on. We had 3 different versions. So in this first version, you're sort of sitting there face-to-face with the physician. In the second version, you're up on the examination table, and the physician is a little bit below you. And in the last one, the physician is up on one of those chairs you roll around, and you're physically below. Really subtle. That was the only difference across these scenarios. And yet, we found a pretty significant difference in the level of comfort that people had in being honest, just based on that physical setup. So with one emergency department here in town, I worked with now the former COO on coming up with a different strategy for soliciting feedback and for creating a sense of safety and comfort among their patients especially. And I don't know if you've ever had the chance or the opportunity to do a workshop or train physicians, especially with the way they communicate with patients. It's not the easiest thing in the world, right? I think I got one laugh, that's good. So to make a long story short, one of the things we eventually convinced them to do was one small subtle difference. Rather than coming in and having the clipboard and looking over the patient and talking to the patient through the clipboard, they would sit down at the end of the bed or pull up a chair. And so now they're having a conversation at the same level as the patient. And that small subtle difference had a change in the patient satisfaction scores. Small subtle cues make a huge difference for how you set up the tenor of these conversations. So one of the things I talk about quite a bit is lunch with the president. If you want to take this away from a medical setting, there's a president for one of the credit unions, and he had in place a program that every month he would take out about 6 employees from different parts of the organization. And the deal was that if you showed up with an idea to improve the place, he would buy you lunch. And if you didn't, then lunch was on you. So it was a small, subtle cue that propelled people to come to the table with an idea, but it was also held off-site. It was out of the credit union. It was away from his big desk and big office. It was in a much more informal and inviting type of context. Thirdly, you can make feedback a regular and casual thing. So another things that I often recommend are these small little huddles. So like a quick 10-minute check-in at the beginning of the day or beginning of the week. There was a insurance company, a call center. They had cookie chats every Friday afternoon at like 4 o'clock. Put a plate of cookies out on the table. The general manager for that call center would just hang around and ask what had been going on for that particular week. Informal way to get more routine feedback. Fourthly, you can be the example. As a leader, it's not just enough to launch the system and then expect everybody to do everything. Once you get those ideas coming across your way and you don't have the authority or the resources to implement it yourself, be willing to then go up the chain of the command and ask for more resources. And then lastly, closing the loop. I'll end with the story for the Ideas of Texas. I've seen so many of these types of programs and initiatives go south because you simply don't follow up with employees about where their ideas are. That was actually the thrust of the research project that I did at Google over the summer. They've sort of solved for the safety issue. They have a ton of very proactive employees who speak up all the time. And they have an overwhelming amount of feedback and not enough bandwidth to resolve all of them. And so with that many ideas, a lot of ideas kind of fall through the cracks and they never follow up with employees about what's being done or not. And it creates a lot of frustration and resentment. So if you're going to offer these types of programs, and again, one of the nice things that I think KaiNexus has is a mechanism to close the loop, to follow up with people about where their idea is, why it's being implemented or not, and how they can better pitch them down in the future. So I'll close with one of my very favorite quotes, Winston Churchill. Courage is what it takes to stand up and speak, but courage is also what it takes to sit down and listen.